On the morning of August 16, 1780, in a clearing of swampy pine woods just north of Camden, South Carolina, 200 American Continental soldiers stood in a line that should not have existed. Their commanding general had already fled. He was 60 miles away on the back of a fast horse, riding north, abandoning them. To their front, a wall of British regulars advanced through the dawn fog with 17-inch bayonets fixed. To their flank, the most disciplined infantry in the world wheeled into position. To their rear, dragoons formed up to charge. By the time the sun cleared the trees, fewer than 137 of them would walk off that field as an organized force. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or scattered into the swamps. They were the finest soldiers the Continental Army had, and they had been thrown away. Battles are not always lost on the battlefield. Sometimes they are lost weeks earlier, in tents, in marching orders, in the arrogance of a man who refuses to listen. We remember the men who fell. We forget the decisions that placed them there. At Camden, both happened, and the elite of an army died for the failure of one man who would not be standing beside them when the bayonets came. By the end of this video, you will understand 3 documented facts that historians still study at military academies today. First, the catastrophic logistical decision recorded by Colonel Otho Holland Williams that left 200 elite Continentals dysenteric, dehydrated, and starving on the morning of the battle. Second, the 18th century doctrine of the place of honor that Horatio Gates followed by the book, and how that single rigid choice placed his weakest troops directly opposite the most lethal infantry in the British Army. Third, the 60-mile flight by a sitting American major general while his men were still fighting and dying behind him, a flight so disgraceful it ended the career of the hero of Saratoga in a single morning. But here is what makes this engagement historically extraordinary. How did 2 armies, marching at night on the same road in opposite directions, fail to detect each other until they collided in pitch darkness at 2 in the morning? Why did veteran Continentals, abandoned and outnumbered roughly 2-to-1 in regulars and far worse on the field, refuse to break for nearly an hour when the rest of the army had already evaporated? How did a Bavarian-born baron of 59 take 11 separate wounds and continue fighting on foot after his horse was shot from beneath him? And why does the actual battlefield, preserved today in South Carolina, contain the bones of teenagers in shallow graves that archaeologists exhumed only in 2022? This battle was not about numbers. It was about the difference between the men who stood and the man who ran. Hit subscribe. Let us step into Sanders Creek to understand how 1 in 200 of America's best soldiers ended up alone in a Carolina clearing facing annihilation. We have to step back to the summer of 1778, when the British High Command in London made a decision that would change the entire shape of the Revolutionary War. By 1778, the war in the northern colonies had stalled. George Washington's Continental Army had survived Valley Forge, fought the British to a draw at Monmouth Courthouse, and refused to be drawn into the kind of decisive open-field battle that British generals desperately wanted. The British commanders looked at their maps and saw an unwinnable equation in the north. They needed something else. They needed a new theater. They needed a population that could be turned. They turned south. The theory that emerged in London was called the Southern Strategy, and it rested on a single assumption. British planners believed that beneath the surface of rebellion, the southern colonies were filled with silent loyalists, Americans loyal to the crown, who had been intimidated into silence by their patriot neighbors. If British regular troops could establish a presence, the theory went, these loyalists would rise, organize, and reclaim the South for King George III. In December 1778, the British tested the theory. They captured Savannah, Georgia, with stunning ease. The provincial government was restored. The strategy seemed to work. In the spring of 1780, the British committed to the gamble fully. General Sir Henry Clinton sailed south with a massive expeditionary force aimed at Charleston, South Carolina, the wealthiest, largest, most strategically vital city in the southern colonies. The siege of Charleston was a masterclass in 18th century European siege warfare. Clinton invested the city methodically, cutting off every line of retreat, every avenue of supply. The American commander, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, found himself trapped on the Charleston Peninsula with no way out and no relief coming. On May 12, 1780, he surrendered unconditionally. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 6,000 American troops were taken prisoner in a single act of capitulation. Among them were 2,200 Continental regulars, the irreplaceable professional core of the Southern military establishment. In one stroke, the American military presence in the South had been erased. It was the largest American surrender of the entire war, a disaster so comprehensive that it would not be exceeded until Bataan in 1942. Clinton sailed back to New York, satisfied that the Southern theater was effectively won. He left command of the South to his aggressive deputy, Lieutenant General Charles, Lord Cornwallis. Cornwallis was a different kind of commander. Where Clinton was cautious and methodical, Cornwallis was decisive and offensive-minded. His mandate was clear: establish a chain of fortified outposts across the South Carolina interior. Pacify the backcountry, restore royal government, prepare for the invasion of North Carolina and Virginia. Camden became the linchpin of this operation. Situated approximately 125 miles northwest of Charleston, at a critical crossroads near the Wateree River, Camden was the primary British supply depot for projecting power into the interior. From Camden, Cornwallis could supply garrisons across the backcountry, move troops in any direction, and maintain control over a vast swath of the South. But controlling the cities did not mean controlling the country. Within weeks of Charleston's surrender, Cornwallis discovered a brutal truth. The backcountry was not pacified. It was at war with itself. A vicious civil war erupted between Whig patriot militias and Tory loyalist militias, a war of assassination, reprisal, and burned farms. Partisan commanders emerged from the swamps and the hills: Thomas Sumter, Andrew Pickens, and most famously, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, whose lightning raids against British supply convoys made the Carolina backcountry a nightmare for any British force operating away from its bases. Into this fractured, violent, contested landscape, the Continental Congress decided to insert a new army. The decisions made in Philadelphia in June 1780 were the first link in the chain that led to the disaster at Camden. After the loss of Charleston, Congress recognized that something had to be done. A new Southern army had to be raised, and someone had to command it. George Washington, the commander-in-chief, knew exactly who that someone should be. He recommended Major General Nathaniel Greene, his most trusted subordinate, the quartermaster who had saved the army at Valley Forge, a tactician whose grasp of logistics and strategy was unmatched in the Continental establishment. Congress ignored him. Instead, on June 13, 1780, Congress independently appointed Major General Horatio Gates to command the Southern Department. The appointment was political. It was a snub to Washington, and it was about to cost the cause an entire army. Gates carried a reputation that towered over his actual ability. He was known across the colonies as the hero of Saratoga, the general credited with surrounding and capturing the British army of John Burgoyne in 1777. Saratoga had been the decisive victory of the Revolution. It had convinced France to enter the war on the American side. It was the closest thing to a war-winning battle the Americans had achieved. But Saratoga had not really been Horatio Gates's battle. The terrain had favored the Americans. The brilliance of his subordinates, particularly Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan, had dictated the tactical course of the fighting. Gates had presided over a victory more than he had commanded it. What he had demonstrated was political skill. He had built alliances in Congress. He had cultivated journalists. He had managed the narrative. What he had not demonstrated was tactical competence in an open field battle against British regulars. His former colleague, General Charles Lee, who knew him well and disliked him intensely, offered a warning that would prove almost supernatural in its accuracy. Lee told Gates to take care, lest his northern laurels turn to southern willows. Gates rode south to take his new command, convinced that he was about to add to his legend. What he found waiting for him at Cox's Mill, North Carolina, on July 25, 1780, was not an army ready for glory. It was 200 men starving in their tents. These 200 soldiers were the absolute professional core of what would become his new Southern Army. They were Continental regulars from Maryland and Delaware, units with a fighting reputation second to none in the Continental establishment. The Maryland line had bled at Long Island, at White Plains, at Brandywine, at Germantown. The Delaware Regiment was considered by many to be the finest battalion in the entire Continental Army. They were commanded by Major General Johann von Roby, Baron de Kalb, a massive 59-year-old veteran born to peasant parents in the Bavarian village of Hüttendorf in 1721 and risen by sheer talent through 3 decades of service in the French army. He had crossed the Atlantic to America with the Marquis de Lafayette in 1777. He was a professional soldier in a way few American-born officers could match. A man who had spent his entire adult life learning the trade of war in the European school. He was, by every contemporary account, immensely capable, immensely brave, and immensely loyal to the cause he had crossed an ocean to join. Washington had originally dispatched de Kalb's regiment south in the spring of 1780 to relieve Charleston. They had marched hard. They had marched for months. They had arrived too late. Charleston had fallen before they could reach it. Now they sat at Cox's Mill, cut off from regular supply, foraging in hostile country, watching their boots disintegrate, their uniforms turn to rags, their rations dwindle to nothing. When Gates arrived to take command, these were the men he found, the elite. Starving, he should have stopped. He should have rested them, fed them, equipped them, integrated his new reinforcements. He should have listened to de Kalb and to the Maryland Adjutant Colonel Otho Holland Williams, both of whom understood exactly what condition these men were in. He did not stop. He did not listen. He gave the order to march. The army that would die at Camden was already dying before it ever heard a British drum. While Gates assembled his ragged force, Lord Cornwallis had something very different waiting at Camden. The British Army in the Southern Theater was small, approximately 2,100 to 2,239 men, less than the combined American total on paper. But the composition of that force represented some of the most lethal professional soldiers in the world. At the core were 2 regiments of British regulars whose names carried centuries of fighting reputation. The 23rd Regiment of Foot, the Royal Welch Fusiliers, a unit whose battle honors stretched back to the late 17th century, and the 33rd Regiment of Foot, which was Cornwallis's own regiment, of which he was the colonel, commanded in the field by Lieutenant Colonel James Webster, an officer whose tactical instincts were so sharp that historians still consider him one of the finest infantry commanders the British Army produced in the entire war. These men were not militia. They were not provincials. They were professional infantry, trained to fight in linear formation, to advance under fire without breaking, to deliver volley fire at point-blank range, and most terrifyingly, to charge with the bayonet. The bayonet charge was the signature weapon of the British regular, a line of red-coated regulars advancing in silence, in perfect formation, with 17 inches of triangular steel fixed to the end of every musket, was a sight engineered to break the will of any opposing force before the lines ever met. Supporting the regulars were loyalist provincial units trained to regular army standards. Chief among these was the Volunteers of Ireland, commanded by Francis Lord Rawdon, a unit composed largely of Irish immigrants who had thrown in their lot with the Crown. They were not amateurs. They drilled like regulars. They fought like regulars. And then there was the British Legion. The British Legion was Cornwallis's most dangerous weapon, a combined arms force of dragoon cavalry and light infantry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, an officer not yet 26 who had already built a reputation for ruthlessness that would follow him through history. Tarleton specialized in shock cavalry tactics, in psychological warfare, in the relentless pursuit of broken enemies. Just 3 months earlier, at the Waxhaws, Tarleton's Legion had cut down surrendering Continentals in what Patriot newspapers immediately labeled a massacre. The phrase Tarleton's Quarter had entered the American vocabulary, meaning no quarter at all. This was Cornwallis's instrument, a small professional army, lethal in every component, coiled and ready. Cornwallis himself was not the cartoon villain that later mythology made him. He was a serious, competent professional soldier. He understood logistics. He understood tactics. He understood the rare and valuable skill of identifying an opponent's weakness and striking it without hesitation. He was about to do exactly that. There is a question worth pausing on. Why did Congress choose Horatio Gates? The answer reveals something military historians have argued about for 2 centuries. Congress did not choose him because he was the best general. They chose him because he was the most politically useful general. Gates had cultivated his allies in Congress for years. He had positioned himself as a Republican alternative to what some delegates perceived as Washington's aristocratic tendencies. He had cultivated newspapers. He had managed his reputation with a skill that most generals reserved for their tactics. This is the danger that every army faces when political considerations override military ones. The commander who looks best in the chambers of government is often not the commander who performs best on a battlefield. The skills do not transfer. A man who excels at managing committees can be catastrophically out of his depth when he has to manage 3,000 men under fire. Gates was about to discover this truth in a swampy pine clearing on the morning of August 16, 1780. So were his men. The march that destroyed the American army began on July 27, 1780. When Gates arrived at Cox's Mill, he found 200 starving Continentals. He had been expected to consolidate them with reinforcements, rest them, supply them, and prepare for a careful campaign. Instead, 2 days after taking command, he issued an order that astonished every experienced officer in the camp. He designated the ragged force his Grand Army, and he ordered them to march immediately toward Camden. Colonel Otho Holland Williams, the Deputy Adjutant General and commander of the 6th Maryland Regiment, would later write in his memoirs that the order was a matter of great astonishment to those who knew the real situation of the troops. The word astonishment carried weight. Williams was a professional. He chose his words carefully. To use the language of astonishment to describe a commanding general's order was, for an officer of his temperament, a damning indictment. DeKalb pleaded with Gates. Williams pleaded with Gates. Both veteran officers urged the same alternative. Do not march directly south on the most exposed route. Take the western route, looping through the fertile counties of Rowan and Mecklenburg. Regions filled with Patriot sympathizers who would feed the army, who would offer reinforcements, who would shield it from British cavalry harassment. The western route was longer in distance. It was shorter in suffering. It would deliver the army to Camden alive. Gates refused. He chose the direct route south, through the Carolina Pine Barrens. The Pine Barrens were not a road. They were a region, a long stretch of sandy, swampy, scrub pine wilderness running between the settled regions of North Carolina and the British-occupied territory around Camden. The land was almost uninhabited. What few settlers existed were largely loyalist. There was no food to forage. There was no friendly population to support the march. There were no farms to raid. There was nothing. And Gates ordered an army of men, already starving, to march through it. The decision to refuse local partisan support compounded the disaster. Francis Marion himself, the Swamp Fox, offered his services and his men. Marion knew every trail, every swamp, every hidden creek between the PD River and Camden. His intelligence was invaluable. His knowledge of British movements was current and accurate. He was offering everything Gates needed. Gates dismissed him. The dismissal was characteristic. Gates did not value irregular warriors. He did not value intelligence from unconventional sources. He valued the symbols and the appearance of regular European-style warfare. Marion did not look like a regular officer. He did not command regular troops. He could not be useful, in Gates's view, to a regular general fighting a regular campaign. This decision alone may have been the most catastrophic intelligence failure of the campaign. What followed in the Pine Barrens was an unmitigated catastrophe of human suffering. The supply wagons lagged miles behind. The troops were left to forage in country that offered nothing to forage. They ate what they could find. Green corn, picked unripe from the stalk. Green peaches, hard and sour. Wild greens, whatever the swamps and pine flats offered. Gates, in an attempt to boost morale, issued a ration of heavy molasses to substitute for the rum the army no longer had. What happened next is documented in contemporary accounts with a kind of horrified specificity. The combination was poison. Green corn, unripe fruit, heavy molasses, all ingested by men already weakened by months of malnutrition, marched through August heat in heavy wool uniforms. The result was a catastrophic, army-wide outbreak of dysentery. Dysentery is not a polite illness. It is violent, painful, dehydrating, debilitating. Men who contract it cannot march. Men who must march while contracting it cannot fight. The army staggered forward, the line of march constantly interrupted as soldiers broke ranks to relieve themselves in the brush. Hundreds were sick. Many could not keep up. The wagons, when they finally arrived, were filled with men too weak to walk. The tactical implications of mass dysentery in an 18th century army are easy to underestimate. The standard infantry drill of the period required a soldier to load and fire his musket 3 times per minute, in formation, shoulder to shoulder. It required strength to ram the cartridge, steadiness to prime the pan, and the ability to stand upright in tight ranks under fire. A man weakened by chronic diarrhea and dehydration cannot do these things. He cannot stand in close formation because he may need to leave it at any moment. Multiply that across 1,000 men, and you have an army that looks like an army on paper, but cannot fight like one in the field. This was the army that Gates was leading to fight, Lord Cornwallis. Veteran Continentals, broken in their bodies, hollowed out by hunger and disease, before a single British musket had been fired in their direction. And Gates remained blindly optimistic. He had convinced himself that his army was vast. He believed his ranks had swelled to over 7,000 men with the arrival of militia reinforcements. He spoke of crushing Cornwallis with overwhelming numbers. He spoke of marching into Camden as a liberator. Colonel Williams, troubled by what he was seeing, conducted an actual field return. He counted the men present and fit for duty. The number he handed to his commanding general was not 7,000. It was 3,052. 3,052 men, roughly half the strength Gates believed he commanded. A force still nominally larger than Cornwallis's army, but only nominally. 2/3 of it was untested, exhausted, dysenteric militia. Only 1,200 were Continental regulars. And those 1,200 were the sickest of the sick, marching at the spear point of an army staggering toward catastrophe. Gates looked at the return. He read the number. He handed it back to Williams. "These are enough for our purposes," he said. He ordered the march to continue. The road to Camden was paved with green corn and arrogance. The men paid for both. By the evening of August 15, 1780, the exhausted American army reached Rugeley's Mill, approximately 8 miles north of Camden. The men were spent. They had marched through the pine barrens. They had eaten what could not be digested. They had suffered through August heat with dysentery tearing through their ranks. They needed rest. They needed water. They needed time. Gates gave them none of these things. What Gates did not know was that Cornwallis had hastened from Charleston to take personal command at Camden. The British general had received intelligence about the American advance. He had assessed his situation. He had measured his enemy. And he had concluded that the smaller, professional British force could destroy the larger, ragged American one if it struck quickly, before Gates could consolidate, before he could establish a siege, before the militia could be properly integrated. Cornwallis saw little to lose. He saw much to gain. He gave the order to attack. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary coincidences in military history. 2 commanding generals, sitting in headquarters 8 miles apart, separately conceived the exact same operational plan on the exact same night. At 10 in the evening on August 15th, Horatio Gates issued orders for his army to break camp and conduct a night march south along the Great Wagon Road. The objective was to secure a stronger defensive position at Sanders Creek, closer to Camden, before the British could intercept. At 10 in the evening on August 15th, in his headquarters in Camden, Lord Cornwallis issued orders for his army to break camp and conduct a night march north along the Great Wagon Road. The objective was to surprise the Americans at Rugeley's Mill before dawn. 2 armies, the same road, opposite directions, same hour, neither commander aware of the other. The night was sweltering. The humidity of August in South Carolina hung in the air like a wet blanket. There was no moon. The Great Wagon Road was a narrow corridor through dense, swampy pine forest, the kind of terrain where visibility at night was effectively zero. Neither commander deployed adequate forward scouting. Tarleton's Legion led the British advance, Colonel Charles Armand's small cavalry force, 60 horsemen of mixed French and American background, led the Americans. They moved toward each other in pitch darkness. At approximately 2 in the morning on August 16th, 1780, the 2 vanguards collided. The collision was chaos. Tarleton's dragoons, riding hard at the front of the British column, charged directly into Armand's American cavalry. The shock of the impact drove Armand's horsemen back into the leading column of the 1st Continental Brigade, marching behind them. Men went down in the dark. Horses screamed. No one knew what was happening. No one could see who was firing at whom. But the Continental infantry behind Armand did not break. This is a moment worth pausing on. In the middle of the night, ambushed by cavalry they could barely see, exhausted from a forced march, weakened by disease, the leading Continentals held. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Porterfield and Major Armstrong, commanding the American light infantry on the wooded flanks of the road, kept their men in position. They delivered a disciplined volley into the British cavalry. The volley halted Tarleton's charge. It killed several dragoons. It made the British vanguard recoil. Both armies froze. In the darkness, neither commander could assess what he had run into. Was this a scouting force? Was this the main enemy army? How many were they? Where were they? The fog of war, that famous phrase, was literal that night. Black powder smoke, pine swamp humidity, no moon, no visibility, just musket flashes and shouting in the dark. Cornwallis made the decision first. He ordered his army to halt, deploy into battle line, and wait for the sun to rise. Gates, 8 miles back along the line of march, did the same. For 4 hours, 2 armies stood in the dark, listening to each other, smelling each other, knowing that dawn would bring something neither commander had planned for. Not a clandestine maneuver, not a siege, a pitched battle in the open. The exact engagement Gates had no business fighting with the army he had. The men in the Continental lines tried to rest in their formations. Many could not. The dysentery did not pause for tactical situations. Some men were so weakened they could barely stand. Others fixed their bayonets and tried to drink from canteens that were already empty. And ahead of them, in the same darkness, the Royal Welch Fusiliers and the 33rd Regiment of Foot waited. The trap had not been set. The trap had been walked into from both sides at once. Only one army had the strength to spring it. The battlefield at Sanders Creek, when it revealed itself in the gray light of dawn, was the kind of ground that decides battles before they begin. It was a narrow clearing, several hundred yards wide, cut into dense pine forest. On both the left flank and the right flank, the trees pressed in close, and beyond the trees lay swampy, impassable ground. The geography was a corridor, a funnel. It permitted no wide flanking maneuvers, no sweeping cavalry envelopments, no tactical creativity. Whatever was about to happen would happen head-to-head, in straight lines, in the linear fashion that 18th century warfare demanded when terrain allowed nothing else. This terrain, more than anything else, dictated what came next. The battle would be decided by which line could outshoot, outlast, and outbayonet the other. As the morning fog began to lift, Gates deployed his army according to the strictest interpretation of 18th century European tactical doctrine. There is a phrase in the military theory of the period: the place of honor. Customarily, the right flank of the line was considered the place of honor, the anchor of the formation, the position where a commander placed his most experienced and reliable troops. The right was the strong side. The right was where the army should not break. Gates followed the doctrine to the letter. On the American right, he placed his 1-200 Continental regulars, the Maryland and Delaware troops, the elite. They were commanded by Major General DeKalb, with Brigadier General Mordecai Gist directly in charge of the brigade. These were the men who had marched through the Pine Barrens, the men who had bled at Brandywine and Germantown, the men who could be trusted to hold a line. In the center, Gates placed Brigadier General Richard Caswell's North Carolina militia, approximately 2,000 to 2,500 men. Inexperienced, largely untrained, many had never been under fire. On the left, Gates placed Brigadier General Edward Stevens's Virginia militia, roughly 700 men, several hundred of whom had only joined the army within the past week. Some of these Virginians had been handed their muskets so recently, they had not yet been instructed in how to use them properly. In reserve, slightly behind the main line, Gates placed the 1st Maryland Regiment under Brigadier General William Smallwood, separating one of his best Continental regiments from the main body of regulars on the right. This was the American line. From the right, in descending order of military quality, elite Continentals, untested North Carolina militia, even less prepared Virginia militia, a reserve of Maryland regulars positioned awkwardly behind the line. Across the clearing, Lord Cornwallis was watching. Cornwallis was a professional. He observed the American deployment through the morning mist. He saw the regulars on the American right. He saw the militia on the American left. He saw what every veteran officer in his army saw, and he made the decision instantly. Cornwallis arranged his own line in reverse. He placed his strongest troops, his veteran British regulars, on his right flank, directly opposite the American left. The 23rd Regiment of Foot, the Royal Welch Fusiliers, the 33rd Regiment of Foot, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Webster, the most tactically gifted infantry commander in the British Army that morning. On his left, facing the American Continentals, he placed Lord Rawdon with the Volunteers of Ireland and supporting provincial troops. These were elite loyalist units, trained to regular standards, but they were not the killers. They were the holding force. Their job was to fix the American right in place, while the decisive blow fell on the American left. In reserve, behind his own lines, Cornwallis held Banastre Tarleton and the British Legion cavalry, coiled, waiting, ready to exploit any breakthrough. The pattern is worth recognizing. Cornwallis had inverted the place of honor doctrine. Instead of strong versus strong on the right, he had matched his strongest against the American weakest. His weakest, the Volunteers of Ireland, against the American strongest, the Continentals. He understood that battles are decided where the lines break first, and he had arranged his line so that his line would not break on his right. Gates had arranged his line according to a book. Cornwallis had arranged his line according to a battlefield. The Virginia militia on the American left, men who had been in the army for less than a week, men still suffering from dysentery, men who had never fired a musket in combat, were about to face the most lethal infantry regiment in the British Army, the 33rd Foot, the Royal Welch Fusiliers, James Webster. In the morning fog, the sun began to climb. The two armies could finally see each other clearly. The drums began to beat. The Battle of Camden was about to begin. The doctrine of the right flank had become the geometry of disaster. The book had killed an army. The battle began shortly after dawn, somewhere between 5:30 and 6 in the morning, when the fog had lifted enough to permit aimed musket fire. Gates, attempting to seize the initiative, ordered the Virginia militia on his left to advance and engage the British right with musket fire. It was the textbook opening move. Press the enemy, establish the dominant fire, force them to react. Cornwallis did not react. He acted. The instant Cornwallis saw the Virginians begin their advance, he ordered Lieutenant Colonel Webster to launch a full frontal assault with the 33rd and 23rd Regiments against the American left. What followed was theater, in the most literal sense. The British regulars stepped forward in perfect linear formation, 3 ranks deep, the bayonets fixed and gleaming in the morning sun. They moved at a measured pace, the drums and fifes setting the rhythm. They did not fire. They did not shout. They did not break formation. They simply advanced in absolute silence, 2 of the most professional infantry regiments in the world, walking toward the American line as though the muskets pointing at them did not exist. The bayonet charge was not just a tactic. It was a psychological weapon, refined by the British Army over a century of warfare. The visual impact was deliberate. Hundreds of 17-inch triangular blades, the red coats, the perfect alignment, the silence, the inevitability. It was designed to project a single message into the mind of every defender watching. We are coming. and we will not stop. There is a phenomenon in battle that veteran officers of the 18th century understood intimately. Untested infantry can stand under musket fire for a remarkable amount of time. They can watch men around them fall and continue to load. The fire they can bear. What they cannot bear is the bayonet. Musket fire is random, impersonal, the work of a metal ball that may or may not find you. The bayonet is the man 20 feet away, coming specifically to kill you with 17 inches of steel. It makes the killing personal. Properly presented in disciplined formation, it breaks men. For the Virginia militia, dysenteric, exhausted, ill-equipped, untrained, this was the first time many of them had ever seen British regulars advance. It was also the last. The British closed to within musket range. They had not yet fired a single shot. And then, on Webster's command, they let out a great cheer. The cheer was deliberate. It was choreographed. It was the moment in the script when the regulars announced their arrival. The Virginia militia broke before the British were within 50 yards. It happened so fast that no eyewitness could agree on exactly when it began. The militia threw down their muskets. They did not fire. Some had loaded muskets in their hands when they turned and ran. They simply dropped them and fled. The American left dissolved, not in defeat, in panic. The North Carolina militia in the center watched the Virginia line evaporate beside them. They had been holding. They had not yet engaged. They saw what was coming. Most of them broke too. Only one regiment of North Carolina militia stood its ground. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Dixon's regiment, positioned closest to the Delaware Continentals on the right of the militia line, held in place when every other unit around it ran. Proximity to the Continentals may have steadied them. Dixon himself may have refused to allow it. Whatever the reason, his single regiment was the only militia formation that did not break, and it would fight alongside the Continentals through the rest of the engagement. Within the span of a few minutes, the rest of the militia, perhaps 2,500 men, were in full flight. They were not retreating. They were not falling back. They were running for their lives into the swamps and the pine woods behind them, throwing away their weapons, their packs, their hats, anything that slowed them down. Major General Nathaniel Greene, who would later command the Southern Theater and study the Camden disaster in detail, observed the phenomenon of militia panic with the eye of a professional. Panic, he wrote, operates like electricity. It is irresistible where it touches. It had just touched 2/3 of the American army. And it carried Horatio Gates with it, the hero of Saratoga, mounted near the reserve position roughly 200 yards behind the main line. Found himself directly in the path of the rout. He did not ride forward. He did not ride to the Continental right where his elite troops were preparing to engage. He did not attempt to rally his men or to organize a withdrawal that might preserve some portion of his force. He turned his horse north, and he rode. He rode hard. He rode fast. He did not stop. By nightfall on August 16th, he was in Charlotte, North Carolina, 60 miles from the battlefield. Within 3 days, he was in Hillsborough, North Carolina, 180 miles from the field where his army had been left to die. The flight was unprecedented in scale. American generals had retreated before. American generals had been defeated before. American generals had not, in the history of the Revolution to that point, abandoned their command and ridden 180 miles in 3 days while their men were still fighting and dying behind them. Alexander Hamilton, when news of Gates's flight reached Washington's headquarters, wrote a private letter to James Duane on September 6, 1780. That would become the most quoted indictment of the entire affair. But was there ever an instance of a general running away as Gates has done from his whole army? Hamilton wrote. And was there ever so precipitous a flight? 180 miles in 3 days and a half. It does admirable credit to the activity of a man at his time of life. Hamilton acknowledged in the same letter that he was Gates's enemy personally, and that his words should be weighed accordingly. The letter circulated widely anyway. The words stuck. They have followed Gates for 2.5 centuries. Gates's career was over by sundown, but the battle was not. The general had ridden away. The Continentals had not yet learned they were alone. There is a question military historians still debate about Camden. Could the militia have been saved? The traditional answer is no. 18th century militia were not designed to stand against regular infantry in open ground. They were citizens with muskets, called up from their farms for weeks of service. They had not been trained in the close order drill that allowed regulars to stand under fire and deliver disciplined volleys. Asking them to face Webster's regiments in a stand-up fight was asking them to do something they were never built to do. But Nathaniel Greene, when he later took command of the Southern Theater, demonstrated that militia could be used effectively. At Cowpens in January 1781, Daniel Morgan would place his militia in the front line, give them a specific limited mission, fire 2 volleys, and then withdraw to the rear. And the militia would hold. They would do their job. And the regulars behind them would finish the battle. The difference was leadership. Morgan understood his militia. Gates did not. Morgan asked his men to do something they could actually do. Gates asked his men to do something they could not. This is the truth that Camden teaches, and that every commander since has had to relearn. Soldiers can only execute the orders that match the troops they are. Pretending otherwise does not produce victory. It produces corpses. On the right flank, the Continentals did not yet know. The smoke of black powder, dense and acrid, combined with the morning fog and the trees, had reduced visibility to almost nothing across the battlefield. The Continentals could hear musket fire from their left. They could hear shouting. They could not see what was happening to the militia. They could not see the rout. They could not see their commanding general riding away. They were engaged with Lord Rawdon's troops to their front. And they were doing more than holding. Under DeKalb's orders, the Maryland 2nd Brigade and the Delaware Regiment had advanced. They had delivered disciplined volleys at close range. They had charged with the bayonet. They had twice driven Rawdon's line back. And at one point, they had nearly broken it entirely. Cornwallis himself, watching from behind the British line, had to ride forward in person to rally the volunteers of Ireland and steady the Loyalist provincials before they collapsed. For the first phase of the engagement, the Continentals were not losing. They were winning their part of the battle. Then Cornwallis acted again. The British general saw the militia disintegrate. He saw the entire American left and center collapse. And he saw what every veteran officer would have seen. The American right, the Continentals, were now exposed. Their flank, which had been protected by the militia, was now open. There was nothing between Webster's victorious regulars and the left flank of DeKalb's brigade. Cornwallis ordered the wheel. The British right, having just routed the militia, pivoted 90 degrees and drove into the exposed left flank of the American Continentals. At the same time, Lord Rawdon's Volunteers of Ireland and the Provincials continued their pressure on the Continental front. The Continentals were now being attacked from 2 directions at once. What happened over the next 45 minutes is one of the most astonishing examples of unit cohesion in American military history. The Maryland and Delaware regulars did not break. They were outnumbered. They were flanked. They were starving. They were sick. Their commanding general had fled. Their militia support had evaporated, They were, by any rational calculation, finished. They held the line. De Kalb, the 59-year-old Bavarian-born veteran, was at the center of the resistance. His horse was shot from beneath him within the first minutes of the close engagement. He continued fighting on foot, his sword in his hand, rallying the regiments around him. He led counterattacks. He pushed the Continentals forward into bayonet charges of their own, driving Rawdon's troops back twice in moments where the line seemed about to break. He took wounds. He took more wounds. He kept fighting. Behind him, the Continental line settled into something that contemporary observers would describe with a kind of awe. The Maryland and Delaware troops were trading volleys with the British regulars across a distance of 40 yards, then 30, then 20. They were standing in open ground, in linear formation, exchanging fire at point-blank range with the most disciplined infantry in the world. And they were giving back what they received. Volley for volley, man for man, bayonet for bayonet. Colonel Otho Holland Williams attempted to save the situation. He rode to the rear, where Brigadier General William Smallwood's 1st Maryland Brigade was positioned as reserve. De Kalb had ordered the reserve forward. They had not arrived. The flight of the militia had swept directly through the reserve's position. Smallwood himself had been separated from his men in the chaos. The 1st Maryland Brigade was scattered, partly because the panicked militia had run through them, partly because Webster's wheeling regulars had already begun to wedge between the reserve and the main line. Williams worked frantically to gather what survivors he could. But he could not assemble enough cohesion to break through the British infantry now interposed between the two American forces. He rode back toward the front, to his own regiment, the 6th Maryland, which was on the main line as part of Gist's 2nd Brigade. He pleaded with them. He told them their brothers in the rear could not reach them. The response came from Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Ford, the regimental commander. Ford looked at the British line advancing through the smoke. He answered Williams in the bleak honesty of a professional soldier facing the end. "They have done all that can be expected of them," Ford said. "We are outnumbered and outflanked. See the enemy charge with bayonets." The reserve was eventually forced back under intense pressure. The link to De Kalb could not be made. The Continentals on the main line were on their own. On that main line, the fighting had now reached the point where formations begin to disintegrate. The smoke was so thick that men could not see beyond 10 yards. The British and American lines had closed to where bayonets met. It was no longer linear warfare. It was a brawl. Men were stabbing each other with bayonets. They were clubbing each other with musket stocks. They were grappling and falling and rising and stabbing again. De Kalb was still fighting on foot. He had taken wounds to his head. He had taken wounds to his body. He continued. Cornwallis watched. He understood now what every British commander present understood. The Continentals would not break under infantry assault. They would have to be broken by something else. He ordered Tarleton forward. The infantry could not break them. So Cornwallis sent the men who broke surrendering soldiers at the Waxhaws. Tarleton's British Legion cavalry came in from the rear. This is the moment that ends the resistance. The Continental line, fixed in front and flank combat with Webster and Rawdon, had no time to face about. No formation to receive a cavalry charge, no reserves to commit. The dragoons came at the gallop, sabers drawn, the unmistakable thunder of mounted men closing at speed. Cavalry into the rear of engaged infantry is one of the most ancient and lethal tactics in warfare. And at Camden, it worked exactly as the textbooks predicted. The physical shock came first. A galloping dragoon and his horse together weighed over 1,000 pounds and moved at 25 miles per hour. The horses themselves became weapons that no fixed bayonet could counter, because the bayonet was on the wrong side of the man. The psychological shock followed instantly. Infantry trained to face forward cannot reorient against an attack from behind without breaking formation, and formation was all that held them. And the geometric shock was final. A line cannot defend in three directions. Men engaged front, flank, and rear simultaneously have nowhere left to point their muskets. The Continental line shuddered. It bent, and then it broke. At the center of the collapse, DeKalb fell. He had been on his feet for nearly an hour after his horse was shot. He had taken wound after wound. Contemporary accounts record 11 separate wounds before he finally went down. 3 from musket balls, 8 from bayonets. The precise sequence impossible to reconstruct, but the cumulative effect clear. The 59-year-old Bavarian-born baron, who had crossed an ocean to fight for a cause that was not his own, collapsed on the ground in a pool of his own blood, still attempting to rally men who could no longer hear him. Brigadier General Mordecai Gist, recognizing that further resistance would result in complete annihilation, finally gave the order to retreat. The retreat was not a retreat. It was a sauve-qui-peut, every man for himself. The Continentals broke apart. Some ran into the swamps, some fought their way out in small clusters. Some were ridden down by Tarleton's dragoons. Some surrendered. Some died on the spot. The slaughter continued for hours, well after the formal battle was over. Tarleton's cavalry pursued the fleeing Americans for more than 20 miles. They cut down unarmed stragglers. They captured the sick who could not run. The Legion, true to its reputation, gave little quarter. DeKalb was found alive on the battlefield by British soldiers. He was carried to the British camp. He was given what medical attention the 18th century could offer, which was very little. He died 3 days later, on August 19, 1780, of his wounds. His final hours were spent dictating a letter. The letter was not to his family. It was about the men he had commanded. He spoke of his deep affection for the courage of his Maryland and Delaware troops. He spoke of the honor of having led them. He died praising the men who had refused to leave him until cavalry came through their rear. That is the kind of officer he was. That is the kind of soldiers they were. The battlefield, by the time the firing finally stopped, was a scene that veteran observers struggled to describe. The morning fog had burned off. The smoke had begun to clear. What remained was visible to anyone with the stomach to look. Hundreds of American dead, most of them concentrated on the Continental right where the final resistance had occurred. Wounded men crying out, horses dead and dying, discarded muskets and equipment scattered for hundreds of yards. And in the distance, the sound of Tarleton's cavalry, still pursuing. The battle had ended. The killing had not. The accounting of the Battle of Camden, when the British finally tallied it, was almost too lopsided to credit. British losses were minimal by any standard of 18th century warfare. 68 killed, 245 wounded, 11 missing. A total of 324 casualties from an engaged force of approximately 200 men. The British had lost less than 15% of their force, and most of that loss was concentrated in the wounded, men who would recover. American losses were catastrophic. The exact numbers vary by source, as is typical for 18th century engagements, where the chaos of the field made precise counting impossible. Modern historical estimates converge on the following figures. Approximately 300 to 400 American soldiers killed on the field. Approximately 800 to 900 wounded. Approximately 1,000 captured. A total of approximately 2,200 American casualties from a force of 3,052 fit for duty. 2/3 of the army destroyed in a single morning. But the raw numbers conceal the deeper disaster. The catastrophe of Camden was not evenly distributed across the American force. The militia, who had broken and fled before serious engagement, suffered relatively light casualties. They had run. They had survived. Many would walk home over the following weeks. The 1,000 who were captured were largely from the militia. The killing had been concentrated on the Continentals. The Maryland line, the heart of the American professional army in the South, lost approximately 50% of its strength in killed, wounded, or captured. Half of an elite formation, half of irreplaceable veterans, gone in less than an hour. The Delaware Regiment fared even worse. Delaware had sent one of the finest battalions in the entire Continental Army to the Southern Theater. They had served with distinction at Long Island, at Germantown, in every engagement Washington had ordered. They entered the battle with 8 full companies. They emerged with their unit effectively destroyed. 20% killed in action, 30% captured. All of their field officers lost, including Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Vaughn and Major Patton. The regiment was so thoroughly decimated that in the weeks after Camden, the scattered survivors had to be consolidated into just 2 understrength companies of 96 men each. The unit, as it had existed for 4 years, no longer existed. And here is where the harrowing arithmetic of the title becomes specific. The figure of 137 survivors does not refer to the total number of Continentals who survived in any form. Hundreds of Continentals survived as prisoners, taken from the field by the British, marched south to Charleston, and loaded onto disease-ridden prison hulks where many would die over the months that followed. Others were forced under duress into British service, particularly into the Volunteers of Ireland, where they would later fight against their former comrades. The 137 figure refers to something different. It refers to the number of Continentals who fought their way off the battlefield as organized, cohesive combat units. Soldiers who had not broken, soldiers who had not surrendered, soldiers who had extracted themselves from the catastrophe under the leadership of their officers, still functioning as a unit, still capable of fighting. The fate of the 1,000 who were captured deserves its own accounting, because their suffering did not end on the battlefield. The British marched the prisoners south, first to Camden, then down the long road to Charleston. By the time the column reached the coast weeks later, hundreds were already dead from wounds, exhaustion, and dysentery. In Charleston Harbor, the survivors were loaded onto prison hulks, decommissioned ships stripped of their masts and then anchored permanently in the harbor. The men below decks were packed into airless holds in temperatures that in a Carolina summer reached over 100 degrees. Disease swept through the spaces. Typhus, smallpox, dysentery again. By conservative modern estimates, more than half the men confined there in the fall of 1780 did not survive the winter. Others, particularly the Irish-born Continentals, were coerced into British service. The Volunteers of Ireland, the loyalist unit commanded by Lord Rawdon, was actively recruiting from the prisoner population. Some men accepted to escape the hulks. Some accepted under duress. Some refused and died. At least several hundred former Continentals ended up fighting against the cause they had originally enlisted to defend. The extraction itself was an act of extraordinary discipline under impossible circumstances. Brigadier General Mordecai Gist, when he finally gave the order to retreat, managed to hold together approximately 100 Maryland Continentals. He led them in a fighting withdrawal through the deep swamp on the right flank of the field, the same swamp the British had been unable to flank around. Gist's men waded through chest-deep water and mud, carrying their muskets above their heads, moving in disciplined order, refusing to break apart even as Tarleton's dragoons hunted along the firmer ground at the edges of the swamp. At the same time, a rear guard of approximately 50 to 60 Continentals formed under the leadership of Major Archibald Anderson, Colonel John Gunby, Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard, Captain Henry Dobson, and Captain Robert Kirkwood of the Delaware Regiment. This group fought through the British encirclement, holding off pursuing cavalry, allowing scattered remnants of the broken army to escape into the brush behind them. Colonel Otho Holland Williams, riding through the chaos, helped coordinate what could be coordinated and would later write the most detailed surviving narrative of the disaster. Gist's 100, Anderson and Kirkwood's 60, roughly 137 to 160, depending on how you count. That is what was left as an organized fighting force of 1,200 elite Continental regulars. The men who walked out of that field were caked in mud, blood, and black powder. They had not slept in more than 24 hours. They had not eaten properly in weeks. They were the survivors not just of the battle, but of the entire catastrophic campaign that had led to it. They were the seed corn of every future Continental campaign in the South. And they were not yet finished suffering. In the days following the battle, the misery compounded. A group of Maryland Continentals who had escaped the immediate slaughter linked up with the partisan forces of Thomas Sumter at Great Savannah, near Fishing Creek. They believed, after 20 miles of pursuit by Tarleton, that they had finally outrun the British. They stopped to rest. They cooked food. Some bathed in the creek. Their muskets were stacked. Tarleton, with characteristic ruthlessness, found them. The Legion struck without warning. The Americans, unarmed, exhausted, half-dressed, could not reach their weapons in time. 150 Americans were killed in minutes. 300 were captured. Tarleton's cavalry, in a single surprise attack at Fishing Creek, destroyed what little remained of organized American resistance in the immediate vicinity of Camden. It was August 18th, just 2 days after the main battle. The disaster was now total. An army does not die in a single battle. It dies in the days that follow, in the small slaughters that finish what the main slaughter began. There is something about the death of an army that resists comprehension at the level of statistics. The numbers obscure rather than reveal. To say that the Delaware Regiment was reduced from 8 companies to 2 companies of 96 men is to use the language of bureaucracy to describe the deaths of brothers, of cousins, of farm boys from the same county who had enlisted together in 1776 and marched together for 4 years. In 2022, an archaeological project at the Camden battlefield brought this truth back into focus. Researchers from the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust, the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, and the Department of Natural Resources excavated the remains of 14 soldiers buried in shallow graves on the field. 12 were identified as American Continentals. 1 was a Loyalist militiaman. 1 was a British soldier from the 71st Fraser Highlanders. The forensic analysis revealed what contemporary accounts had only hinted at. Many of the American dead were teenagers, boys in their late teens, killed by British bayonets, buried where they fell, forgotten by history for more than 2 centuries. The Sons of the American Revolution launched a DNA project, attempting to extract genetic material from the recovered bones and match it to descendants of the Maryland and Delaware lines. The goal was simple: to finally place names on the headstones of soldiers who had been unknown for almost 250 years, to return their identities to them. This is what the battle was, beneath the tactics and the geometry and the casualty reports. It was teenagers from Maryland and Delaware, lying in shallow graves in the Carolina sand, while a general who had abandoned them rode 180 miles to safety. The destruction of the Southern Army triggered an immediate crisis in Philadelphia. Horatio Gates, when his 180-mile flight finally became public knowledge, was finished. The pretense that he was the hero of Saratoga could not survive Camden. He was relieved of command. A court of inquiry was eventually ordered, though it would be years before the proceedings concluded, and the verdict was technical rather than damning. The damage to his reputation was complete in any case. He would never hold a major field command again. His correspondence in the months after Camden reveals a man trying to defend the indefensible, citing the failure of the militia, citing the impossibility of his position, citing everything except the choices he had personally made. Congress finally did what George Washington had urged from the start. They appointed Major General Nathaniel Greene to command the Southern Department. Greene took command in December 1780, 4 months after Camden. What Greene inherited was a wreck. The remnants of the Continental Army in the South numbered approximately 2,300 men, slowly rebuilt through reinforcements during the autumn months. Of these, only 800 were properly armed and clothed. The rest were short of muskets, short of bayonets, short of cartridge boxes, short of shoes. Greene later wrote that he had taken command of an army that was nothing more than a shadow. But Greene was not Gates. He understood with a clarity that Gates never possessed what kind of war could be fought with the army he actually had. He could not fight a stand-up European battle against Cornwallis. He did not try. Instead, Greene adopted a strategy of division, exhaustion, and strategic withdrawal that would become a textbook example of how to defeat a superior enemy with an inferior force. Greene divided his army into highly mobile columns. He sent Daniel Morgan into the Western Carolinas with one wing. He moved with the main body in a different direction. He forced Cornwallis to choose: pursue Morgan or pursue Greene. Whichever he chose, the other column would strike at his supply lines. The strategy paid off almost immediately. In January 1781, at the Battle of Cowpens, Daniel Morgan delivered one of the most perfect tactical victories in American military history. He destroyed Tarleton's British Legion, the same legion that had pursued the fleeing Americans at Camden, that had killed surrendering soldiers at the Waxhaws, that had ridden down stragglers for 20 miles after Sanders Creek, was annihilated as a fighting force in less than an hour. The survivors of Camden, the men of the 137, were not absent from these later campaigns. Captain Robert Kirkwood's consolidated Delaware companies, Otho Holland Williams's reorganized Maryland regiments. They formed the professional corps of Greene's army. They fought at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, where Greene inflicted such heavy casualties on Cornwallis's army that the British general was forced to withdraw to the coast. They fought at Hobkirk's Hill in April 1781, a battle sometimes called the Second Battle of Camden, fought on terrain close to where the catastrophe of August 1780 had occurred. They fought at Eutaw Springs in September 1781, the last major engagement in the Southern theater. In every one of these battles, the Continentals who had survived Camden, the men who had walked out of that field as part of the 137, were the disciplined backbone that held Greene's lines together. Cornwallis, meanwhile, had been bled white by Greene's strategy. The British victories of 1781 were Pyrrhic. Each one cost Cornwallis irreplaceable veterans. Each one drew him further from his coastal bases. Each one extended his supply lines into hostile country. By the autumn of 1781, Cornwallis had withdrawn his exhausted army to the Virginia coast, to a small town on the Yorktown Peninsula. He had requested resupply from the Navy. He had requested reinforcement. What arrived instead was George Washington, the French army of the Comte de Rochambeau, and the French fleet of the Comte de Grasse. Cornwallis was trapped. The siege lasted 3 weeks. On October 19, 1781, the British army that had destroyed Gates at Camden, that had won every major engagement in the Southern theater except Cowpens, surrendered at Yorktown. The revolution was effectively won, and the chain of cause and effect that led to Yorktown began, paradoxically, in the disaster at Camden. The Camden catastrophe had ended the career of Horatio Gates. It had brought Nathaniel Greene to the Southern Command. Greene's strategy had bled Cornwallis. The bleeding had driven Cornwallis to Yorktown. Yorktown had ended the war. The men who died at Camden and the 137 who survived had been the first link in that chain. They did not know it. They could not have known it. But the victory of 1781 was built, in part, on the catastrophe of 1780. The men who fell at Camden did not die for nothing. They died for a year of disasters that would, somehow, become victory. The men of Camden, the survivors and the dead, deserve to be remembered by name. Major General Johann von Roby, Baron de Kalb, died of his wounds 3 days after the battle, on August 19, 1780. 2 months past his 59th birthday. He had taken 11 wounds, 3 from musket balls and 8 from bayonets, in defense of soldiers who had become, in his final words, the object of his affection. He was buried in Camden, where his grave still stands today in the churchyard of Bethesda Presbyterian Church. In 1825, the Marquis de Lafayette, on his triumphal tour of America, laid the cornerstone of the monument over it. De Kalb is one of the foreign-born officers of the Revolution who never made it home. Brigadier General Mordecai Gist, who led the fighting withdrawal of the 100 Marylanders through the swamp, survived the war. He continued to serve under Greene in the Southern Campaign. He fought at Eutaw Springs. He lived until 1792. Colonel Otho Holland Williams, the deputy adjutant who had begged Gates to listen to reason and who had organized the rear guard at Camden, became one of Greene's most trusted lieutenants. He commanded the light troops that screened Greene's withdrawal across North Carolina in the famous race to the Dan River in early 1781. He fought at Guilford Courthouse, at Hobkirk's Hill, at Eutaw Springs. He lived until 1794, dying of tuberculosis contracted during the war. Captain Robert Kirkwood, who emerged from Camden commanding what was left of the Delaware Regiment, became one of the most consistently engaged combat officers of the entire war. By the count of his biographer, P. Benson Delaney, Kirkwood was present at 33 separate engagements, more than any other company commander in the Continental Army. He survived the Revolution unwounded. In 1791, he re-entered service as a captain in the 2nd U.S. Regiment under Major General Arthur St. Clair, deployed to the Northwest Territory against the Northwestern Confederacy, led by Blue Jacket and Little Turtle. On November 4, 1791, at St. Clair's defeat near present-day Fort Recovery, Ohio, he was killed. The fiercest battles of the Revolution had not touched him. His final fight was in another army, on another frontier, in another war. Horatio Gates lived until 1806. He spent his final decades attempting to rehabilitate his reputation through letters and through political maneuvering. He never succeeded. The 180-mile flight had defined him. It could not be unwritten. He died in New York, his career a cautionary tale that military officers would study for 2 centuries. Lord Cornwallis went on to surrender at Yorktown the following year. He was not destroyed by the surrender. He returned to Britain, served as Governor-General of India, returned to military command in Ireland, and died in India in 1805. He never spoke at length about Camden, the battle that had been his greatest tactical victory. Perhaps he understood that battles are remembered by their consequences, and the consequences of Camden had been, ultimately, the road to Yorktown. Banastre Tarleton, the cavalry commander whose charge had broken the Continental line, returned to Britain after the war, entered politics, became a member of Parliament. He spent his political career defending the slave trade. He lived until 1833. A controversial figure in British memory, a hated figure in American memory. The man who had given his name to a kind of warfare that admitted no quarter. The men of the 137, the soldiers who walked out of Camden as a fighting force, are mostly anonymous. The officers we can name, the privates, the corporals, the sergeants who waded through the swamp with Gist or fought through the encirclement with Anderson, Howard, and Kirkwood, are nameless to history. The DNA project at the Camden battlefield in 2022 was an attempt to recover some of these names. The work continues. History remembers commanders. It buries the men who made their decisions possible. Camden is studied at military academies. It has been studied at West Point. It is studied at Sandhurst. It is studied at the staff colleges of armies that have no historical connection to either side of the engagement. The reasons are timeless. The first lesson is the cost of arrogance in command. Horatio Gates entered the campaign convinced of his own genius. He ignored the advice of professionals who knew the terrain, who knew the troops, who knew the enemy. He ignored intelligence from local partisans. He ignored the warnings of his own staff. He marched an army through country that could not support it. He fed his men a diet that broke their bodies. He deployed his line according to a doctrine that handed his enemy the perfect target. Every one of these errors was avoidable. Every one was the product not of bad luck, but of a commander who believed his judgment was superior to the evidence in front of him. This is a failure mode that survives across centuries and technologies. The commander who believes his own legend, who refuses to listen to subordinates, who trusts his instincts over his intelligence, is a danger to his army. The specific mistakes change. The pattern does not. The second lesson is the importance of matching troops to mission. Gates placed dysenteric, untrained militia in a position where they would have to face the most lethal infantry in the British Army. He demanded of them what they could not do. Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan at Cowpens demonstrated the inverse. They asked militia to do what they could do. Fire 2 volleys. Withdraw. The militia held. The battle was won. Soldiers can only execute the orders that match the soldiers they are. Pretending otherwise produces catastrophe. The third lesson is the catastrophic interaction between logistics and combat. The Pine Barrens March did not kill anyone directly. No British musket was fired, no bayonet was thrust. The Pine Barrens March simply destroyed the physical capacity of the American army to fight. By the time the soldiers reached Sanders Creek, they were already broken. The battle was a formality. This pattern recurs constantly in military history. Armies are destroyed by what they cannot carry, by what they cannot eat, by what they cannot drink. The actual combat is often the final chapter of a logistical story that has already been decided. The fourth lesson is the value of professional cohesion under impossible circumstances. The Maryland and Delaware Continentals, abandoned by their general, flanked by veterans, charged in the rear by cavalry, refused to break. For 45 minutes they held a line that every rational calculation said should have broken in 5. Why? The answer has nothing to do with tactics. It has to do with the bonds that veteran soldiers develop with each other and with their officers. DeKalb led from the front. He fought on foot after his horse was shot. He took wound after wound and continued. The men around him fought because he fought. They fought because they had fought together at Brandywine and Germantown. They fought because the man on their left and the man on their right were their brothers. This is the variable that no tactical manual can quantify. It is also the variable that decides battles. The American Continentals at Camden did not win. They could not have won. But they made the British pay a price that contemporary observers on both sides found shocking. They refused to be destroyed cheaply. The fifth lesson is the role of geography in 18th century warfare. The narrow clearing at Sanders Creek, with swamps on both flanks, dictated everything that followed. It eliminated maneuver. It forced linear combat. It rewarded the army with the better discipline and the better troops. Cornwallis did not have to be a tactical genius at Camden. He had to recognize what the terrain was doing for him, and he had to deploy his line accordingly. He did both. Gates did neither. He deployed by the book. The book did not account for the terrain. This is a final, recurring lesson of military history. The terrain is always present. The commander who fights the terrain, rather than fighting with it, is the commander who loses. The lessons of Camden do not expire. They wait in the manuals for the next commander who believes his name is enough. The Camden battlefield is preserved today. It is one of the most intact, undisturbed Revolutionary War sites in the United States. There are no large monuments. There are no parking lots filled with tour buses. The clearing where 200 Continentals made their stand is still mostly clearing. The pine forests on the flanks are still pine forests. The swamps that pinned the Maryland and Delaware troops, that forced the linear engagement, that gave Mordecai Gist his escape route, are still swamps. If you walk the field today, in the early morning, before the August humidity rises, you can see what the soldiers saw. The narrow corridor of open ground, the dense trees pressing in, the light filtering through the morning haze, the silence of a place that does not feel like a battlefield, because no monument tells you it is one. In 2022, the archaeologists who found the 14 graves were careful about the work. They photographed everything. They recorded the position of every bone fragment, every button, every musket ball. They reinterred the remains with full military honors. They placed flags on the graves. They began the work of identifying, through DNA matching, the descendants of the unknown soldiers who had lain in the Carolina sand since 1780. The work continues. New graves may yet be found. New names may yet be added to the list of the identified. The men of Camden, who had been forgotten for nearly 250 years, are slowly being remembered. This matters because of what they represented. They were not heroes in the Hollywood sense. They were not perfect men. Many of them had not chosen to be at Camden. They had been ordered there by a general who had abandoned them. They had been fed green corn and unripe peaches. They had marched with dysentery tearing through their guts. They had fought a battle that should never have been fought. But when the British line advanced, they stood. When the militia broke around them, they stood. When their general fled, they did not yet know. They stood for 45 minutes against the most disciplined infantry in the world. They stood for the man on their left and the man on their right. They stood for the Bavarian general who would not leave them. They stood because that was who they were. And 137 of them walked off the field in two small groups through the swamps and the brush, carrying their muskets above their heads, refusing to break formation even in extraction. They would fight again at Guilford Courthouse, at Hobkirk's Hill, at Eutaw Springs. They would be there when the Southern theater finally tilted toward American victory. They would be there in the army that Greene rebuilt, when the chain of consequences from Camden finally led to Yorktown. There is a moment in every great battle that the participants remember more vividly than any other. For the Maryland and Delaware Continentals at Camden, that moment was not the cavalry charge. It was not the bayonet exchange. It was not the death of DeKalb. It was the silence. After the militia broke, after the panic ran like electricity through the American center and left, there was a strange interval, perhaps a minute, perhaps less, when the Continentals on the right had not yet engaged Webster's troops in their flank. They could hear the militia running. They could not see why. They could see Lord Rawdon's lines to their front. They could see their own officers calmly correcting alignment, dressing the line, preparing for the volley exchange they had been trained for. It was the last moment, for many of them, when the world made sense. Then the smoke shifted. Then Webster's regiments emerged from the haze on their left flank. Then the line had to wheel. Then the order came down to refuse the flank, to fire in two directions at once, to hold against forces twice their number coming from forces they could not see coming. The slow moment ended. What followed was 45 minutes of the most intense close-quarters combat the Southern theater would witness. Volleys at 30 yards. Volleys at 20 yards. Bayonets fixed. The cheers of the British regulars as they closed. The cries of the wounded as men went down in the front rank, and the men behind stepped over them to take their place. And in the middle of it, DeKalb on foot, his horse dead, his sword in his hand, the white-haired Bavarian, rallying men who could no longer see 10 feet through the smoke. The sword in the air. The voice cutting through the chaos. The men responding. Closing ranks, loading, firing, loading, firing. For 45 minutes, the impossible held. When Tarleton came in from the rear, it was not a tactical decision. It was the recognition by Cornwallis that nothing else would work. The dragoons crashed into the back of the Continental line at the gallop. The horses themselves knocked men down. The sabers came down from above. The Continentals, fixed in front and flank combat, could not turn to receive the charge. This is the moment the line ends. Not the moment it breaks, exactly. The moment it ends. The cohesion that had held for 45 minutes was no longer possible. The men could not face 3 directions at once. The geometry of resistance had collapsed. DeKalb went down in this final phase. 11 wounds. The exact moment cannot be reconstructed. What can be reconstructed is what the men around him saw. The general, on his feet, in the middle of the chaos, going down at last. The cumulative weight of every wound finally too much. The white-haired figure, the great voice that had held the line, falling silent. Gist gave the order to retreat. The men around him were already in flight. The order was less a command than an acknowledgement of what was already happening. The collapse, when it finally came, was not the panic of the militia. It was something different. It was the disintegration of a force that had fought to the absolute end of its capacity. The Continentals scattered into the swamps. Some surrendered. Some fought through. Some died in small groups, refusing to be taken. Tarleton's dragoons pursued through the brush, cutting down stragglers, capturing the wounded. Gist gathered what he could. 100 men. Maryland Continentals, mud-caked and bloody, muskets still in their hands. He led them into the swamp on the right flank. They waded through chest-deep water. The dragoons could not follow there. Williams, Anderson, Gunby, Howard, Dobson, and Kirkwood gathered what they could. Roughly 50 to 60 men, Delaware survivors and Maryland regulars. They fought through the encirclement, holding off cavalry, covering the scattered remnants. 2 small forces, 160 men, by the most generous count. Roughly 137 by the count, that excludes wounded who would not survive the next days. They walked out of the field that they should not have survived. This is not just the story of a defeat. It is the story of what survives a defeat. The men who could not be killed in formation. The men who would walk 20 miles in mud and blood and continue. the men who would form the core of the army that fought at Guilford and at Eutaw Springs, the men whose disciplined refusal to break, even in the moment of total collapse, became the seed of the army that would eventually trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. The 137 were not the end of something. They were the beginning of something else. They did not know it. They could not have known it. They were exhausted men in mud, carrying muskets and the memory of a Bavarian general who had died praising them. They were the survivors of a battle that should never have been fought, ordered by a general who had abandoned them. But they survived. And what they survived with, what they carried with them, was the knowledge of how to stand, how to hold a line when the men beside you have run, how to fight in formation when the formation has been broken, how to die in place if necessary, and how to extract in order if extraction was possible. These were the lessons they took to Greene. These were the lessons they took to Cowpens. These were the lessons they took, ultimately, to Yorktown. The catastrophe of Camden became the foundation of the victory that followed. The men who could not break in defeat became the men who could not be broken in victory. The Battle of Camden, fought on the morning of August 16, 1780, was the most catastrophic American defeat of the Revolutionary War, apart from the surrender of Charleston 3 months earlier. Approximately 300 to 400 Americans killed on the field, approximately 800 to 900 wounded, approximately 1,000 captured, total American casualties of approximately 2,200 from an engaged force of 352. British casualties were 68 killed, 245 wounded, 11 missing. A total of 324, less than 15% of the British engaged force. The Maryland line lost half its strength. The Delaware Regiment was effectively destroyed. The Southern Army, as a coherent fighting force, ceased to exist. The political consequences were immediate. Gates was relieved of command. Greene was appointed. The strategy of the Southern War shifted from confrontation to attrition. The chain of events that would lead, 14 months later, to Yorktown began with a disaster at Sanders Creek. The 137 Continentals who walked off the field as organized survivors became the professional corps of every American army that fought in the South for the remainder of the war. The battlefield is preserved. Some of the dead have been identified through forensic archaeology. Others remain unknown, awaiting DNA matches that may or may not ever come. The lessons of Camden are taught in military academies on multiple continents. Horatio Gates died in 1806. His reputation, despite his efforts, never recovered. Lord Charles Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in 1781. He died in India in 1805. Banastre Tarleton entered British politics. He died in 1833, a controversial figure whose name became synonymous with the kind of warfare that admits no quarter. Baron de Kalb died 3 days after the battle, on August 19, 1780, in the British camp. His last words praised the men he had commanded. Mordecai Gist survived the war. Otho Holland Williams survived the war. Robert Kirkwood survived the war, only to be killed in 1791 in the Northwest Territory, fighting in another army's defeat. The men of the 137, the corporals and the privates and the sergeants who walked out of the swamp with Gist or fought through with Anderson, Howard, Kirkwood, and the other rearguard officers, are mostly nameless. Some of them are being identified, slowly through the work of archaeologists and geneticists 2.5 centuries after they fought. There is a temptation, when studying a disaster like Camden, to make it a story about a single failed commander. Horatio Gates is an easy villain. His decisions were catastrophic. His flight was disgraceful. His arrogance was the proximate cause of nearly everything that went wrong. But the story is larger than Gates. It is a story about the gap between the men who command armies and the men who fight in them. The men who command can fail upward. They can survive their disasters. They can write their memoirs. They can be politically rehabilitated. They can die in their beds at the age of 78, as Gates did. Decades after the soldiers they failed are dust in the Carolina sand. The men who fight do not have these options. They have the line they hold. They have the formation they cannot break. They have the man on their left and the man on their right. They have, in the end, the simple binary choice of standing or running. And they make that choice in conditions that no general who has fled the field can ever fully understand. What happened at Camden was that 200 men were placed in a situation no army should ever be placed in, by a commander who should never have been their commander. And they responded to the impossible by doing the impossible, not winning. They could not win, holding for 45 minutes, until the cavalry came through their rear and the geometry of resistance finally collapsed. This is what soldiers do. This is what they have always done in every war, on every continent. They hold lines they cannot hold, for reasons that have nothing to do with strategy or politics or the names of the generals who command them. They hold for each other. Military historians sometimes call this primary group cohesion. The phrase is sterile. The reality is not. The reality is that the man on your left has fought beside you for 4 years. The reality is that the man on your right is from your county, and you marched with him from Maryland when both of you were 18 years old. And now you are 22, and you can no longer remember a time when he was not standing next to you in line. The reality is that the general at the front of your line, the Bavarian-born veteran twice your age, has stood with you in the Pine Barrens when his own staff urged him to argue harder against the march that was breaking you. And he has placed himself directly in the line of British fire, rather than ride behind a hill and survive what his own commander would not stay to witness. The reality is that none of this is in any tactical manual, but all of it is the thing that decides whether a line breaks or holds. The 1 in 37 who walked out of Sanders Creek were the survivors of that holding. They carried the lesson forward. They fought at Cowpens. They fought at Guilford. They fought at Eutaw Springs. They were there at Yorktown, in the army that Greene had built from the wreckage at Camden. Their general had ridden 180 miles to safety. They had walked 20 miles through swamps to fight again. That is the difference. That is the story. In a clearing of swampy pine woods, on the morning of August 16th, 1780, an army was destroyed and a foundation was laid. The general who ran was forgotten by history, except as a warning. The 200 who stood are remembered by historians, by archaeologists, by descendants who are only now learning their names. The 137 who walked out, walked, ultimately, to Yorktown. Sometimes the men who lose the battle are the men who win the war. Sometimes the disaster is the foundation. Sometimes the line that breaks is the line that, in the breaking, teaches every army that follows it how to stand. The Continentals of Camden did not know any of this on the morning of August 16th, 1780. They were tired. They were sick. They were hungry. They were abandoned. They stood anyway. That is why the battle still matters. That is why the names are still being recovered. That is why the field is still preserved. The general fled. The men did not. That is the whole story. That is enough.